That's where I ended up. After 20 years as a Marine, 15 of those as a scout sniper, I came back stateside with nothing but a stack of medals, a bad shoulder, and too many ghosts. For a while, I tried settling into a normal life, bought a small cabin outside Bozeman, Montana, fixed up an old truck, tried fishing, even gave dating a shot. None of it stuck. The itch never went away, the one that told me to stay sharp, stay ready. Every time the wind rustled the trees or a stranger passed me on the sidewalk, I felt the weight of a rifle in my hands and my finger brushing the trigger. So, I stopped trying to fit in. I stuck to what I knew. Hunting, staying out of sight, and disappearing when I wanted to. By the time the call came, I was a ghost in my own life. No family, no real friends. Just me, my rifles, and a past I didn't talk about. The phone rang at 2 a.m. It always rings at 2 a.m. for jobs like this. I answered out of habit. "Rowen." The voice on the other end was crisp, the kind you don't argue with. "Mr. Rowen, I'm told you're good at solving problems." Quietly. "Depends on the problem," I said, leaning back in my chair. The empty whiskey glass on the table stared back at me. "You don't sound like the local sheriff." "I'm not." A pause. "We've got a situation in Yellowstone. Something's killing hikers. 4 dead in 2 months. Not a bear, not a wolf. Something else." I almost laughed. "Sounds like you need fish and wildlife, not me." "They're out of their depth," the man said, his tone unchanging. "The tracks don't match anything known. Whatever this is, it's big and it's dangerous. We need it neutralized, quietly." "And you think I'm the guy for the job?" "I know you're the guy for the job, unless I've got the wrong Jake Rowen. Afghanistan, Helmand Province, Camp Bastion, Scout Sniper Team Leader." Hearing it said out loud felt like a punch to the gut. Those were names and places I'd tried to bury, but he knew them like they were yesterday. "How quiet does this need to be?" I asked. "Dead quiet," he said. Then he named a number that made me sit up straight. Enough to pay off my mortgage and then some. The line went silent as I weighed my options. I didn't need the money, not really, but something about the way he described it gnawed at me. Strange tracks, a creature no one could identify. I should have said no. Instead, I packed my gear. Yellowstone stretched out before me, endless and ancient. It's the kind of place that makes you feel small, like you're just passing through, and the land couldn't care less whether you stayed or left. The air was cold, crisp, the kind of cold that burns your lungs if you breathe too deep. I'd been places like this before. Afghanistan had its mountains and valleys too, though the air there was hotter, drier, filled with the smell of dust and diesel fuel. The terrain might have been different, but the rules were the same. Respect the land, or it'll kill you. I wasn't a stranger to the hunt. As a sniper, I'd spent weeks tracking targets moving silently, disappearing into the shadows. It wasn't just about the shot. It was about the patience, waiting, watching, calculating every move. I wasn't the fastest, the strongest, or the smartest, but I was the most disciplined. I could sit still for hours, even days if I had to. That's what made me good at what I did. But this wasn't a war zone. There wasn't an insurgent waiting with an AK on the other side of the valley. This was something else entirely. I reached the cabin the client had arranged for me. It was remote, nestled in the trees with no one for miles. Inside, there was a cot, a wood stove, and a single table with a map of the area spread across it. Coordinates were marked in red. Attack sites. I ran my fingers over the map. 3 dots clustered near the Lamar Valley, 1 farther south near Old Faithful. I'd start with the closest one. I unpacked my gear, an old Remington 700 bolt-action rifle, a spotting scope, a suppressed sidearm, and enough MREs to last a week. I double-checked everything. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. You don't get second chances in places like this. As the sun went down, I sat on the cabin's porch, my rifle across my lap, listening to the forest. Somewhere out there was the thing I was supposed to kill. And for the first time in years, I felt the old itch, the hunter's instinct. Whatever this thing was, it had no idea who it was up against. When I stepped out of the cabin the next morning, the frost on the ground crunched beneath my boots. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. I'd spent enough time in wild places to know that wasn't normal. Something had disturbed the balance here, and I had a bad feeling I was about to find out what. I headed toward the first attack site, rifle slung across my back and my spotting scope strapped to my pack. According to the map, it was a little over 2 miles northeast, through thick forest. My breath clouded in front of me as I moved, the cold biting at my face. An hour in, I found the tracks. They were huge, easily twice the size of a bear's paw, but oddly shaped. The toes were long, almost like fingers, and the claws gouged deep into the frozen earth. I crouched next to one, running my hand along the edge. It was fresh, no more than a few hours old. The tracks followed a path through the trees, and I followed them, careful to stay quiet. My training kicked in automatically, light steps, scanning ahead, listening for anything out of place. After a quarter mile, the tracks stopped. I knelt, examining the ground. It didn't make sense. They just ended, as if whatever made them had vanished into thin air. I looked up, scanning the trees, and froze. There was something hanging from the branches above me, a deer carcass, gutted and torn apart. It swayed gently in the breeze, its blood dripping onto the snow below. I stared at it for a long moment, my grip tightening on my rifle. Whatever had killed it hadn't just taken it down for food. This was a message. By the time I reached the clearing where the first hiker had been killed, the sun was high overhead. The smell hit me before I saw the body, rot and copper, thick enough to make my stomach turn. I pulled my scarf up over my nose and stepped closer. The body was a mess, just like the client had described. Torn apart, limbs scattered. The snow around it was soaked in blood, frozen into a dark, sticky mess. I crouched, examining the wounds. They weren't clean. Whatever did this didn't just kill, it enjoyed it. The gashes were deep, the flesh torn as if by claws or teeth. But the strangest part was the lack of tracks. Just like before, there were no prints leading away from the body. It was as if the thing had killed, then vanished. I scanned the area, my eyes sweeping the tree line. The forest was dense, shadows twisting between the trees. I felt exposed, out in the open, like I was being watched. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It was deep, rumbling, vibrating in my chest. My heart started pounding as I swung my rifle up, scanning the trees through the scope. Nothing, just shadows. The growl came again, closer this time. My finger hovered over the trigger as I pivoted, my eyes darting between the trees. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Something was out there, watching me. Then the forest went silent again. I didn't run, but I didn't linger either. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of there, and I wasn't about to argue. I kept my rifle up as I moved, stepping carefully but quickly, scanning my surroundings the whole way back. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the forest in shades of red and gold. I bolted the door behind me and set my rifle on the table, my hands shaking. I hadn't been this rattled since Afghanistan. I lit a fire and sat by the window, staring out at the darkening forest. My mind raced. What the hell was I dealing with? A bear? No, the tracks were all wrong. A wolf? Too big. Something else? Something I didn't want to believe in? The growl echoed in my head as I stared into the flames. It wasn't just the sound of an animal. There was something almost intelligent about it, like it knew I was there and it wasn't afraid of me. Around midnight, I heard the first sound, a thump, heavy and deliberate, coming from the roof. My blood ran cold as I grabbed my rifle and stood, every muscle in my body tense. The thump came again, followed by the sound of claws scraping against the wood. My heart was pounding as I moved to the center of the room, keeping my rifle trained on the ceiling. Then the sound stopped. The silence was worse. My breath came in shallow gasps as I waited, every nerve screaming for me to do something, anything. But then the cabin shook, hard, like something massive had slammed into it. I stumbled, nearly losing my grip on the rifle. The fire flickered, casting wild shadows across the walls. The sound came again, this time from the door. a low, scraping noise, like claws dragging across the wood. I raised the rifle, aiming at the door. "Come on," I muttered under my breath. "Let's see what you've got." The scraping stopped. For a long moment there was nothing but the crackle of the fire and the sound of my own breathing. Then, slowly, the door handle began to turn. The door handle twisted with an eerie slowness, as if whatever was on the other side wanted me to feel the weight of every second. My heart slammed against my ribs, but my hands stayed steady. Years of training, years of waiting for moments just like this. The handle stopped. Silence again. I swallowed hard, keeping the rifle trained on the center of the door. "If you're looking for trouble," I said, my voice low, steady, "you just found it." The door exploded inward. Splinters flew like shrapnel, the force of the impact sending me stumbling back. I caught a glimpse of something, a blur of fur, claws, and glowing amber eyes, before it ducked low, disappearing into the shadows of the cabin. My pulse roared in my ears as I swung the rifle toward the movement, my finger tightening on the trigger. "Come on," I muttered. "Come on, you bastard." It came at me from the left, faster than anything that size had a right to move. I fired, the sound deafening in the small space, but it didn't stop. I barely had time to dive out of the way before it hit the table, shattering it into pieces. My second shot went wild, punching a hole in the wall. I scrambled to my feet, breathing hard, my back against the far wall. The thing turned to face me, and for the first time, I got a good look at it. It wasn't just big. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, its hulking frame covered in matted black fur. Its limbs were long, unnaturally so, ending in claws that looked sharp enough to gut a man with a single swipe. But it was the eyes that froze me. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were intelligent, burning with something that felt far too close to malice. It growled, low and rumbling, the sound vibrating through the cabin. I raised the rifle, aiming for the center of its chest. "Not so tough now, are you?" I whispered, steadying my breath. It lunged. I fired 3 times in quick succession, the round slamming into its torso. It roared, a sound that made my bones feel like they might snap, and staggered back. But it didn't fall. Blood, thick, dark, and almost black, oozed from the wounds, but it only seemed to make the thing angrier. It came at me again, its claws slashing through the air. I ducked, feeling the rush of wind as they passed inches from my face. I threw myself toward the stove, grabbing the heavy cast-iron poker. When it charged again, I swung with everything I had. The poker connected with its head, the impact jarring my arms. The creature howled, reeling back, and I used the opening to grab my rifle from the floor. I didn't aim this time. I just fired, emptying the rest of the magazine into its chest. It stumbled, crashing into the wall with enough force to shake the entire cabin. For a moment, I thought it might go down, but then it locked those burning eyes on me again, and I knew I was out of time. The creature snarled, its chest rising and falling in jagged breaths. Blood pooled beneath it, but it didn't stop. Instead, it pushed itself off the wall, its claws scraping against the wood as it steadied itself. The wounds I'd given it might have slowed it down, but they weren't enough. Not yet. I slammed the bolt on my rifle, ejecting the empty magazine. My fingers worked on autopilot as I pulled another mag from my belt and slapped it into place. The creature watched me, its movements deliberate, calculating. It wasn't just an animal, it was a predator, and I was the prey. This time, it didn't charge. It circled me, keeping low, its eyes locked on mine. I backed up slowly, keeping the barrel trained on its head. My boots crunched against the broken remains of the table, the sound echoing in the tense silence. My mind raced. I needed to put this thing down, but the shots to its chest hadn't done the job. Maybe the head? Maybe something more vital? I couldn't take another chance. The creature feinted to the left, then lunged right. It was so fast I barely had time to react. I fired, the shot grazing its shoulder, but it didn't stop. Its claws raked across my arm as I dove to the side, tearing through the fabric of my jacket and slicing into flesh. Pain exploded up my arm, but I gritted my teeth and rolled to my feet. It came at me again, its claws sweeping low. I jumped back, pulling my sidearm from its holster. The 9mm wasn't my first choice for a beast this size, but it was better than nothing. I aimed for the head and pulled the trigger. The bullet caught it in the jaw, snapping its head to the side. It howled, stumbling back, and I fired again, this time hitting its eye. The creature screamed, a horrible, gut-wrenching sound that shook the walls and clawed at its face, black blood streaming down its fur. I didn't wait. I bolted for the door, yanking it open and sprinting into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I ran, ignoring the searing pain in my arm, the pounding in my chest. Behind me, I heard the creature roar, followed by the heavy thud of its footsteps as it gave chase. The forest was a maze of shadows and twisted branches. I dodged between trees, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The snow slowed me down, crunching loudly beneath my boots. But the creature wasn't having any trouble. Its growls and snarls grew louder, closer as it closed the distance. I needed a plan. I couldn't outrun it, not for long. I glanced over my shoulder, catching a glimpse of its massive form weaving through the trees. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, one of them leaking black blood. But it didn't seem to care. It was hunting me, and it wasn't going to stop until I was dead. My rifle bounced against my back as I ran. I'd have one shot, if I could find the right spot to make it. Up ahead, the trees thinned, giving way to a rocky outcrop. I veered toward it, my boots slipping on the icy ground. The creature was almost on me. I could hear its claws tearing into the earth, its guttural growls vibrating in my chest. I reached the rocks and scrambled up, slipping and sliding, my injured arm screaming in protest. The beast slammed into the base of the outcrop, shaking the ground beneath me. I turned, raising my rifle, and aimed down at the creature. It clawed at the rocks, trying to climb, its glowing eye locking onto me. I steadied my breath, ignoring the pain, the fear, the pounding of my heart. "Come on," I whispered. "Just a little closer." It roared and lunged, pulling itself halfway up the rocks. I fired, the shot punching into its skull, just above the remaining eye. The impact sent it reeling back, its claws scrabbling for purchase. I fired again, and this time, the creature lost its grip. It fell hard, crashing to the ground with a bone-rattling thud. For a moment, everything went still. I stayed where I was, the rifle pressed to my shoulder, waiting. The creature's massive body lay in the snow, black blood pooling around it. Its chest heaved once, twice, then stopped. I stayed perched on the rocks for what felt like an eternity, my rifle trained on the beast. The forest was silent again, the oppressive quiet broken only by the sound of my breathing. My arm throbbed, blood dripping from the claw marks onto the snow below. Finally, I climbed down, my boots crunching softly in the snow. The creature didn't move as I approached, its massive body sprawled across the ground. Up close, it looked even bigger, easily 8 feet tall with claws longer than my fingers. The black blood oozing from its wounds smelled acrid, almost chemical, like something that didn't belong in this world. I knelt next to it, my fingers brushing against the strange matted fur. Its face was twisted in a snarl, its fangs bared even in death. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't natural. It wasn't something that belonged in Yellowstone or anywhere else. I stood, wincing as the pain in my arm flared again. My job wasn't done. The client wanted this handled quietly, which meant no bodies left behind. I wasn't sure how I was going to move something this size, let alone dispose of it. But I'd figure it out. I always did. As I turned back toward the cabin, I caught a flicker of movement in the trees. My heart sank as I raised the rifle again, scanning the shadows. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the wind stirring the branches. Then, far in the distance, I heard it, another growl, low and menacing, echoing through the forest. I wasn't alone, not by a long shot. The growl echoed through the forest, low and guttural, carrying with it a weight that hit me like a cold fist to the chest. I froze, rifle still trained on the tree line, my breath puffed out in short, white clouds, each one betraying how fast my heart was pounding. The thing lying dead at my feet hadn't been alone. My brain kicked into gear, screaming at me to move. Whatever was out there had heard the fight, smelled the blood, and now it was coming. Slowly, I stepped back from the massive corpse, careful to keep my boots from crunching too loudly in the snow. The last thing I needed was to announce my position. I thought about making a run for the cabin, but it was too far. If there was another one of those things, and from the sound of that growl there was, I'd never make it. Instead, I moved toward a cluster of thick pines, their branches heavy with snow. I crouched beneath them, forcing my breaths to slow, steadying my rifle. And then I waited. The forest came alive with the sound of movement. Whatever was out there, it wasn't trying to hide. Heavy footsteps crunched through the snow, slow and deliberate. The sound of branches snapping made me clench my jaw. Whatever this thing was, it was big, maybe bigger than the one I'd just killed. The footsteps stopped. The forest went silent again, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I scanned the tree line, my finger resting lightly on the trigger. Then I saw it. Two glowing amber eyes stared back at me from the shadows, low to the ground, almost as if the thing were crouching. It didn't move. It just watched, its breath visible in short, foggy bursts in the cold air. I aimed for the space between those eyes, steadying my breath. If it charged, I'd get one shot. Maybe two if I was lucky. But this time, I wasn't sure that would be enough. It growled again, low and rumbling, but it didn't come any closer. It stayed in the shadows, its eyes unblinking, unyielding. And then, to my horror, it started circling. I tracked the eyes as they moved, weaving through the trees, the beast staying just out of clear sight. Every instinct screamed at me to fire, but I held my ground. Firing into the dark would only waste my shot, and I wasn't about to make that mistake again. The eyes vanished for a moment, swallowed by the shadows. My pulse quickened as I scanned the forest, searching for any sign of movement. A branch snapped behind me. I spun around, rifle up, and caught a glimpse of it through the scope. It was massive, larger than the first, with thick, matted fur that blended perfectly with the shadows. Its teeth gleamed as it bared them, saliva dripping onto the snow. It was toying with me. The beast lunged, faster than I expected. I fired, the shot catching it in the shoulder, but it didn't stop. Its massive frame hit me like a freight train, knocking the rifle from my hands and sending me sprawling into the snow. Pain shot through my side as I landed hard, but I didn't have time to think about it. The creature was on me, its claws slashing through the air. I rolled to the side, grabbing for my sidearm. It swiped again, its claws tearing through my jacket and grazing my ribs. I screamed, the pain blinding, but I managed to pull the pistol and fire two quick shots. One caught it in the chest, the other in the neck. The beast roared, rearing back, giving me just enough time to scramble to my feet. Blood poured from its wounds, steaming in the cold air, but it didn't go down. If anything, it seemed angrier. I backed toward the dead creature's body, my boots slipping in the blood-soaked snow. My mind raced. I couldn't outrun it. My rifle was out of reach. The pistol wasn't enough. And then I remembered the flare gun in my pack. The beast lunged again, and I dove to the side, landing hard next to the first creature's body. My hands fumbled with the pack's zipper, my fingers numb from the cold and the adrenaline. I could hear the beast snarling, feel the ground tremble as it stalked closer. Finally, I pulled the flare gun free. The beast charged, and I raised the gun, aiming for its face. My hand shook, my vision blurred with pain and fear. But I didn't miss. The flare shot out with a deafening crack, hitting the creature square in the jaw. It roared, a guttural, ear-splitting sound, as the flare ignited its fur. Flames erupted across its face and chest, casting wild shadows across the forest. It thrashed, its massive body crashing into the trees, the fire consuming it. The smell of burning fur filled the air as it stumbled back, its roars growing weaker. Finally, with one last shuddering breath, it collapsed into the snow. I stayed where I was, slumped against the first creature's body, the flare gun still clutched in my shaking hand. My breaths came in shallow gasps, each one a struggle against the pain in my ribs and arm. The forest was silent again. I stared at the second beast's smoldering corpse, the flames slowly dying in the snow. The glow of the fire reflected off the trees, painting the forest in shades of red and orange. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, then another. I knew what that meant. There were more of them. I stayed slumped against the first creature's corpse for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. My body was screaming at me to move, to get up and prepare for whatever was coming next, but the fire in my ribs and arm kept me pinned in place. The smell of burnt fur and blood hung heavy in the cold air, mingling with the distant howls that sent shivers down my spine. My flare gun was empty now, and my sidearm had only a few rounds left. My rifle lay somewhere back in the snow. I was alive, but I wasn't out of this yet. Not by a long shot. I forced myself to my feet, biting back a groan as my wounded side protested. Blood soaked through my jacket where the creature's claws had raked across me, the warmth fading fast in the winter chill. My boots crunched in the snow as I limped toward my rifle, the faint glow of the smoldering fire casting shadows on the ground. When I reached it, I dropped to one knee and checked the chamber. Empty. I fumbled for another magazine, my fingers numb and clumsy from the cold. I slid it home, the familiar metallic snap of the bolt, closing giving me a small surge of confidence. I might not survive this, but I sure as hell wasn't going down without a fight. The second beast's body lay motionless in the snow, smoke still curling from its charred fur. Its massive frame was half buried, and the blood around it had already begun to freeze. I stared at it for a moment, the sheer size of the thing making my stomach churn. Whatever this was, it wasn't natural. I crouched next to the corpse, ignoring the sharp pain in my side, and ran my fingers over the burnt fur. Beneath it, the creature's skin was thick and leathery, almost like armor. No wonder the shots to its torso hadn't dropped it. I looked closer, noticing something else. Its claws. They were coated in a dark, sticky substance that smelled acrid and chemical, like something from a factory. Then I saw it. A small metallic tag embedded in the creature's ear. It was scorched but still legible. I squinted at the faint markings, the letters and numbers etched into the metal. Specimen 12. My stomach twisted. Specimen? What the hell did that mean? This wasn't just some freak mutation or unknown predator. This was something man-made. The howls came again, closer this time. My pulse quickened as I looked toward the tree line, the shadows between the pines growing darker as the last light of dusk faded. I didn't have time to sit here and play detective. If there were more of these things out there, and I knew there were, I needed to move. I stood, slinging the rifle over my shoulder, and glanced back toward the direction of the cabin. It felt miles away, though I knew it was closer. The cabin was my best bet: supplies, shelter, and the chance to make a plan. I started moving, forcing my body to obey, each step a battle against the biting cold and the searing pain in my side. The forest closed in around me, the trees like dark sentinels watching my every move. I kept my head on a swivel, my rifle ready, the weight of my sidearm on my hip, a small comfort. I saw the glow of the cabin's windows through the trees just as the growling started again. Low and guttural, it sent every hair on my body standing on end. I spun, raising my rifle, scanning the forest behind me. The growling grew louder, deeper, coming from all sides now. My hands tightened on the rifle, the cold metal biting into my skin. "Come on," I muttered, backing toward the cabin. "Let's finish this." A shape burst from the trees to my left, a blur of black fur and claws. I fired, the rifle kicking against my shoulder, and the creature let out a howl as the bullet tore into its leg. It stumbled but didn't stop, its massive body barreling toward me. I fired again, aiming for the head. The shot hit true, snapping its skull back, and the beast crumpled into the snow, its momentum carrying it into the trunk of a tree. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned, the cabin just a few yards away. But I wasn't fast enough. The second one hit me from behind, its claws raking across my back, sending me sprawling into the snow. Pain exploded through my body as I rolled, bringing the rifle up just in time to block its snapping jaws. The creature snarled, its glowing eyes inches from mine, hot breath steaming in the cold air. I shoved the rifle forward, using it to push the beast back, and drew my sidearm with my free hand. I pressed the barrel under its jaw and fired. the shot deafening in the stillness of the forest. The creature let out a choked roar, its body convulsing before it collapsed on top of me, dead weight pinning me to the ground. I shoved the corpse off me with a groan, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. Blood seeped through my jacket, the warmth fading fast, but I didn't stop. I staggered to my feet, grabbed my rifle, and stumbled toward the cabin. I slammed the door behind me, bolting it with trembling hands. My breaths came in short, panicked bursts as I leaned against the wall, my body threatening to collapse. The fire in the stove had died down, the room lit only by the faint glow of the embers. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the door handle, then moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. Shadows moved between the trees, the faint glint of amber eyes catching the dim light. They were still out there, watching, waiting. As I slumped against the wall, trying to catch my breath, my eyes fell on the radio sitting on the table. It was an old unit, the kind you'd find in a ranger station, but it still worked. My client had left it as a backup in case I needed to report in. I grabbed it, my bloody fingers fumbling with the dials. Static crackled through the speaker as I tuned it, the sound almost drowned out by the pounding of my pulse in my ears. Finally, a voice came through. Calm, controlled, familiar. "Rowen, what's your status?" I stared at the radio, my hand tightening around it. "What the hell did you send me into?" I growled, my voice raw. "These things aren't animals. They're something else. And they're not natural." There was a pause. Then the voice came back. "You've done well, Mr. Rowen, but this isn't over. I need you to secure a sample and proceed to the extraction point. Coordinates incoming." "Secure a sample?" I barked, my anger flaring. "I'm bleeding out in the middle of nowhere, and you want a sample?" "This is bigger than you, Mr. Rowen," the voice said, cold and detached. "Bigger than Yellowstone. Finish the job." The line went dead. I slammed the radio down, my chest heaving. Outside, the growls started again, closer this time. Whatever this was, I wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. I was fighting for answers. I sat in the cabin, the radio silent in my trembling hands, my body screaming for rest, but my mind racing. Secure a sample. Proceed to the extraction point. The words hung in the air like smoke, choking me with their indifference. Whoever my client was, they didn't care if I lived or died as long as they got what they wanted. I leaned back against the wall, staring at the faint glow of the stove's embers. My side throbbed where the creature's claws had torn into me, and my back wasn't much better. Blood soaked through my clothes, drying stiff in the cold air. I needed to patch myself up, but I needed answers more. The metallic tag in the beast's ear flashed in my mind. Specimen 12. This wasn't some random mutation or undiscovered predator. Someone had made these things. Someone had unleashed them. I wasn't just hunting monsters. I was cleaning up someone else's mess. I forced myself to my feet, every movement a reminder of how close I'd come to dying. On the table lay the map I'd been given, the attack sites marked in red. I spread it out, my eyes scanning the details, looking for anything I'd missed. There, in the southwest corner of the map, just outside the marked attack zone, was a set of coordinates circled in faint pencil. The handwriting wasn't mine, and I hadn't noticed it before. It wasn't the extraction point that was marked farther north, but it could be connected. A lab, a staging ground. My instincts screamed at me to check it out. I didn't have much of a choice. If I was going to survive this, I needed to understand what I was up against. I packed quickly, grabbing extra ammunition, medical supplies, and the flare gun with a fresh round loaded. I couldn't carry the entire creature's body as a sample, but I grabbed the metallic tag from its ear and tucked it into my pocket. It would have to do. The coordinates led me deeper into the wilderness, farther from the cabin and the relative safety it provided. The snow had started falling again, light but persistent, covering the tracks of the creatures that had stalked me. Every step felt heavier, the weight of my injuries slowing me down, but I pressed on. After hours of hiking, I found it, a structure half buried in the snow, its steel walls camouflaged by the surrounding forest. It wasn't large, just a single-story building with no visible markings, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I approached cautiously, rifle at the ready. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind, and the ground around the entrance was littered with deep claw marks and dark stains. Blood. Inside, the air was stale and cold, the hum of dormant machinery filling the silence. The place had been abandoned, but not long ago. Papers were scattered across metal desks. Monitors blinked faintly, with error messages, and the unmistakable stench of death lingered in the air. I moved deeper into the lab, my boots echoing on the tiled floor. In the back of the building, I found it. A containment room. The reinforced glass walls were shattered, and the heavy steel restraints inside were twisted and broken. A clipboard lay on the floor nearby, its pages soaked with dried blood. I picked it up, scanning the notes written in a hurried scrawl. Specimen 12 shows increased aggression. Adaptive behavior suggests intelligence beyond baseline parameters. Recommend immediate termination of project. Further down, a line was underlined twice. Specimens 13 and 14 scheduled for release. My stomach turned as I pieced it together. These weren't random attacks. These creatures had been bred, engineered, and studied. Someone had been experimenting, and when things went sideways, they'd tried to cover it up. But instead of cleaning up their mess, they'd let it loose in Yellowstone. And now I was their cleanup crew. The thought made my blood boil. My injuries, the hikers who died, the hell I'd been put through. It was all because someone in a lab coat thought they could play God. I shoved the clipboard into my pack and turned back toward the entrance. I didn't have time to linger. If specimens 13 and 14 were out there, they weren't going to wait for me to make the first move. The extraction point was marked near a ridge overlooking Yellowstone's western edge. I'd have to cross open terrain to get there, exposed and vulnerable, but it was my only option. I moved quickly, the cold biting at my exposed skin as the wind picked up. When I reached the ridge, the sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. At the edge of the ridge, a helicopter waited, its rotors spinning slowly. 2 figures stood nearby, dressed in heavy coats and carrying rifles. I approached cautiously, my rifle at the ready. One of the figures raised a hand, signaling me to stop. The other stayed still, rifle slung across their chest, but angled just enough to remind me they were watching. I kept my rifle ready, finger brushing the trigger, but I didn't raise it. Not yet. Mr. Rowen, the first man said, his voice calm but firm. He stepped closer, his face partially hidden beneath a hood and scarf. You've done well to make it this far. You have what we asked for. I narrowed my eyes. If by that you mean nearly dying twice, then yeah, I'd say I've done well. The man ignored the jab, his gaze flicking to the pack on my shoulder. The sample. Do you have it? I hesitated, the weight of the metallic tag in my pocket suddenly heavier than it had any right to be. I've got what's left of one of your specimens, I said, and a whole lot of questions about what the hell is going on. The second man shifted slightly, his hand resting on his rifle. The message was clear. I was expendable, but I wasn't in the mood to be intimidated. I found your lab, I said, my voice hard. I know these things aren't natural. You made them. You let them loose, and now you're cleaning up your mess. The first man's expression didn't change, but I caught the faintest flicker of something. Recognition, maybe guilt. The details aren't your concern, Mr. Rowen. You were hired to eliminate a threat and secure a sample. That's all. I stepped closer, ignoring the rifle now aimed squarely at my chest. 4 people are dead because of you, and those things are still out there. This isn't just a threat. This is a disaster waiting to happen. The man sighed, almost as if he pitied me. You don't understand the scope of this, Rowen. What we're doing here, it's bigger than you, bigger than Yellowstone. The world needs what we're working on. Bullshit, I snapped. The world doesn't need monsters tearing people apart in the woods. Whatever you think you're doing, it's not worth the cost. Before the man could reply, a deafening roar erupted from the forest below the ridge. My blood ran cold as I turned, my eyes scanning the tree line. Shadows shifted between the pines, massive forms moving fast, too fast. They found us, I muttered, raising my rifle. The first man's calm demeanor evaporated as he shouted into a radio. We've got incoming. Prepare for immediate extraction. The second man stepped forward, his rifle trained on the approaching shapes. How many? More than one, I said, my voice tight. And they're not happy. The first creature broke from the trees, its hulking form charging up the slope with terrifying speed. It was bigger than the ones I'd killed, its fur matted with blood, and its eyes glowing with rage. Behind it, two more followed, their snarls echoing across the ridge. "Open fire!" the man shouted. I didn't need to be told twice. I squeezed the trigger, the rifle kicking against my shoulder as the first shot hit the lead creature in the chest. It staggered but kept coming. I fired again, aiming for the head, and this time it dropped, skidding to a halt just a few yards from where I stood. The other two were closing fast. The second man opened fire, his automatic rifle spitting bullets at the advancing beasts. One of them fell, but the other lunged, slamming into him with enough force to send him flying. He hit the ground hard, his rifle skittering away as the creature tore into him. I turned my attention to the third one, lining up a shot just as it leapt toward me. My bullet caught it mid-air, the impact throwing it off course. It hit the ground, snarling, and I followed up with another shot to the head. "Rowen, to the chopper!" the first man shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. I glanced toward the helicopter, its rotors spinning faster now. The pilot waved frantically, signaling for us to board. But the second man wasn't getting up. The creature had ripped into him, his blood staining the snow. The lead figure grabbed my arm, dragging me toward the chopper. "Leave him!" "No," I growled, pulling free. I raised my rifle, aiming at the creature still tearing into the downed man. One shot, then another. The beast slumped, lifeless, but it was too late. I turned back to the helicopter, my legs screaming as I sprinted the last few yards. I jumped into the open door, the lead man close behind me. "Go! Go!" he shouted to the pilot. The helicopter lifted off, the ground falling away beneath us. I looked down, watching as the ridge disappeared into the forest below. The creatures' bodies lay still in the snow, but I knew there were more out there. The lead man sat across from me, his face grim. "You've done your job, Rowen. The cleanup team will handle the rest." I shook my head, my anger boiling over. "You think this is over? Those things aren't natural. They're not supposed to exist. And you've got more of them, don't you? What happens when this project of yours gets out of control again?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the floor toward me. "Your payment, as promised." I didn't touch it. "You're playing with fire. One day, this is going to come back to bite you." The man's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "Maybe, but that's not your problem anymore." The helicopter dropped me off on the outskirts of Bozeman, disappearing into the night before I could even gather my thoughts. I stood there for a long time, the envelope heavy in my hand, the metallic tag from the creature still tucked in my pocket. I should have felt relief. I was alive. I'd done my job. But all I could think about were the glowing eyes in the forest and the clipboard from the lab. Specimens 13 and 14 were dead. But what about the others, and what the hell had I just been a part of?